Hello Year 6, today I'm going to talk to you about some watercolour painting techniques for our bird art topic this half term. And I'm just going to run through the equipment that you're going to need today. So you're going to need your watercolour palette, a nice clean and dry lid from the watercolour tin. You will need a clean and dry paintbrush and a large beaker of water. The reason you need lots of water is that when you're rinsing your brushes, you need to rinse off as much of the paint as possible so that you don't contaminate the different colours on the palette with other colours of paint. So as you can see here on this palette, unfortunately the white paint hasn't been treated very nicely. It's a brand new palette of watercolours. We need to make sure we are washing our brushes carefully so that this doesn't happen. Okay, so that's the equipment that we're going to be using. Let's go on to some of the techniques that we are going to use. So I've got my piece of paper here. I'm going to start off by talking to you about some colour gradients. Now the key with watercolours is to go gently, making sure that you haven't got too much water on your brush so that you saturate your paper, making sure that you're not pushing too hard on the brush or into the paints. Everything needs to be done with a bit of gentleness. So start off by getting your brush wet in the water, not too wet. And we're going to choose a colour. Now I'm going to choose this nice blue here. So with my wet brush, not dripping wet, as you can see, I'm going to just gently start to rub it on the palette, pressing really lightly. And I can see I'm getting some colour transfer onto my brush. Now this is going to be quite a deep colour because I've got a little bit of water and quite a lot of paint. So I'm just going to do just a little mark on my paper here. Now because my brush isn't very wet, it's actually quite hard for me to spread the colour around my paper. If you get that, the key with watercolours is to add some more water to it, nice and simple. So I'm going to show you a slightly lighter version of the blue. I am, if I can show you here, I'm rinsing my brush in the water. I've got my paper towel on standby, not above my work so that I cover that up. And if I was going to be changing colour, I would be wiping the brush onto my paper towel, dipping it into the water again and just checking that that colour has come off. The brush might be stained, as you can see here, that's fine. You won't get too much colour transfer, but we need to be getting into the habit of doing that. So now I've got a slightly wet paint on my palette. I'm going to go back into my water pot, tapping my brush on the side. I'm going to add some more water. Now this time, I'm going to, I'll just bring my camera up a little bit. It doesn't want to move. This time, I'm going to dip back into the water, just briefly, give it my brush a little shake, and I'm adding a bit more to the palette. So this time, we can see that the paint is a little bit wetter. I'm going to take my brush, and on my page, I'm going to spread a little more around. You can see how I'm moving the colour around, nice and gently. And you can get really nice gradations of colour in one little piece of your painting. I'm going to go back into my water and again just dry my brush so that I'm in the habit of doing that every time, even if I am using the same colour. I'm going to add even more water, but never so much that it floods over into the next piece. The more you brush the surface of your paints, the more paint comes off and mixes with the water. So this time I'm going to paint here. Now you can see actually when I'm trying to go lighter with my paints, I've gone a bit darker. There's a really easy way to fix this. I'm going to rinse my brush, move my work out the way so I don't drip things on it. I'm going to dry it thoroughly with my paper towel. making sure that the colour's coming off. I'm going to now dip my brush back in the water, tap it on the side, and if I add just water to this colour, I can spread it out and the saturation of colour will reduce. So by that I mean that my colour will become lighter. It would help, wouldn't it, if I'd shown it on the screen. So when you add more water, I'll show you again. I've tapped it on the side of the pot. I'm adding a little bit more water because the last thing I need is really soggy paper. The more I spread it around with water, the lighter the colour I get. So if I want a really light colour, if I want to do a really light blue, what I'm going to do, I know that my palette is wet already, so I'm going to take a dry brush, get a little bit of colour. I'm going to do a small area of my darker colour, rinse my brush, tap, 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 so it's not dripping wet, but it's still got some water on it. And I'm going to spread that colour out. So you can see this is a really light blue, all from exactly the same colour on my palette, but I have got a different gradient of colour. So what I'd like you to try and do in your books is add the little subheading colour gradients. Choose a colour, best to do a different one to your partner if you're sharing a palette. And I want you to start off dark and see how many different variations of colour you can get just across the width of your page. Now we're doing these in our art books, so the paper isn't the proper quality watercolour paper that you would be using for your final piece. It means that it gets wetter a little bit quicker, so go really easy with the water on your brush. The next skill I'm going to show you is mixing colours. As you can see, we're doing birds, and in order to paint birds, we're going to need lots of different shades of colour. And I am going to show you an example using a seagull, and I need a grey for that, but I don't have a grey in my palette, so what can I do? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move my paper out of the way, my book out of the way, because we don't want that to get damaged. This is where the lid of your watercolour set comes in handy. So if I want to use grey in my work, I'm going to wet the black on my palette. I'm going to just work that colour up only with a little bit of water. I'm trying to get as much movement as I can get on the surface of my paint. And I'm going to add some of it to the palette, and to do that I'm just dabbing my brush on there. I'm going to take a bit of water, so I'm going to swish my brush in my water, tap it on the side. I'm going back into the same colour, so I don't need to worry too much about drying my brush on this occasion. Spend a moment working the colour on the top and add some more of that paint to your palette. You're not going to need a huge amount. I'm doing a small seagull, so I've just got that splodge there. Now I'm going into the white next, and if I don't want this to happen, I need to wash my brush really thoroughly. So give it quite a vigorous swish in the water, making sure you're not scraping it along the bottom because that will damage your bristles. Get my paper towel. I can see that I'm not transferring much colour there. Give it another swish for good luck. And I can see that with my water, it's not too, I can see the bottom of the container. It's not too dirty. If it gets too dirty, you need to swap it over. So clean brush into the water, same technique. This is going to end up looking a bit grey on here because there's already black on it. But you're going to just be working the surface of that colour. Now the white is taking a bit more to move, so I'm going to just dip straight into the water, then back onto my palette here. And I can see already that this is a really dirty one. So this is why we want to try and avoid it. But I will still get that white that I need. And hopefully I can save this white by using some of it today. So I'm going to actually scrape some of that wet paint off, and I'm carefully going to pop it in the corner of my palette over here. It's not coming off very well. So I'm going to get another bit of water. Add some more to my palette. I can see my brush is now heavy with paint. I'm adding that separate to the black so I don't cross-contaminate them. Back into my water. Having to use quite a bit of water for the white because I'm going to need quite a bit of it. And I'm keeping them separate so I don't have to wash my brush in between. So I'd like you all to have a try with grey because lots of you are going to be using grey in your work. Once you feel like you have enough on your palette, don't forget we can wash our brushes and go back in. I'm just going to give this a dry. Let me just get a little bit more. Oh, I feel like I'm saving this white slightly. And it's also really good not to leave the colours really wet. So you're trying to scrape off some of that moisture to put in your palette. So I'm going to wash my brush. Give it a dry, and you do need to work fairly quickly with this so they don't dry on the palettes. If they do dry, just reactivate them with water. I'm going to now, just on this side, leaving these as they are, I'm just going to bring some of that grey together. Now you can see quite a lot of liquid there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my paper towel and dry my brush slightly. And I'm going to work these together until I get a nice grey colour. So I'm going to start with quite a dark grey, and I can see that on my brush now. So I'm going to bring my book back in front of me, my paper back in front of me. And I'm going to show that darker grey that I've made from my palette. So I'm adding it on here. I can see that I've got quite a nice dark grey. If it's not dark enough for what I need, I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to choose a bit of my palette that's a darker black. And if I add that in while it's all wet, I can mix that colour directly onto my paper. I'm only tickling the page with the brush because I don't want to damage my brush or the paper. So I'm going to try a little colour gradient with my grey now. I'm happy with the grey that I've made here, but maybe I won't have enough for my whole piece. So I'm going to mix most of it together. Now I'm quite happy with the colour. I'm going to mix what I've got in my palette. I'm going to do a little piece of it there. You can overpaint if you want a darker colour. Let it dry for a minute and go back and paint over. I'm going to add another blob here, but this time, because it's the same colour, I'm going to rinse my brush. Careful not to get any of it near my work. Dry my brush. Dip into the water one more time. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to dip into the water. Dry my brush. Take my paint. That's what I was doing on this one. I got distracted there. That never happens with me. I've also come off the screen. So I've got my blob here that I want to make lighter. So I'm going back into the water and making sure I've not got too much on my brush. Adding that water will lighten that grey. If you go too light, just add in a bit more from your palette. If you're not light enough, add more water. So there you have mixed a colour. I can see there, I can stretch it out and make it really light grey. But with your lighter colours, you'll notice they're quite watery. Have a go with grey, changing those gradients of colour, all from just mixing the colour once on my palette. Now, when I've finished with a colour and I know I'm not going to use it again, it's really important that I'm not going to leave it here. So you can rinse this under the tap, and then you need to dry the top of your palette and keep it nice and clean, ready for the next person to use. Okay, moving on to a technique. Now I've drawn a very, very quick sketch of a seagull here, based on one of Matt Sewell's illustrations. And I'm going to show you how to draw another one as well, because when you are drawing them in your books, you need to press really lightly with your pencil. So I've done it quite dark here so you can see it on the video, but I'm going to show you how to draw it on here, and I'd like you to draw a small seagull at the same time as me. You're going to end up with 2 seagulls just like I have here. Don't worry if it's not a work of art, this is just an experimental page. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to press really lightly with my pencil. So the first shape I'm going to do is this shape of the wing. And I'm just going to press really lightly on my page, and I can see that curves round there. They don't need to be identical. It should be dark enough so that you can just about see it. So you can see here, I've got quite a dark line around this one. Keep it nice and light. The reason for that is that once you've painted on it, if your lines are very nice and light, they'll be camouflaged by the watercolour. If you do really strong pencil lines, then they're going to show through. Now you might want this to happen on certain parts of your birds, but I just wanted to show you the technique for doing a nice light drawing. Okay, so this one seems to have a slightly bigger belly than the other one. I'm not going to go into too much detail, just adding those general shapes. I can see I've got my beak that I can add in, nice little curve shape there. And we're very light on the detail when we're doing these. I'm going to draw the legs, which are just some little sticks with some knobbly knees. And the feet, I'm just going to draw a very brief outline of the feet. I'm not going to go into as much detail as I did there, because what I really want to show you is the painting element. Okay, so I've got a slightly ropey looking seagull there, but I can see it, and that is the important technique. So there are 2 main techniques when you are watercolour painting. There's the wet on dry technique and the wet on wet technique. So they are exactly as they say on the tin. Wet on dry technique, we're using wet paint onto dry paper. So I'm actually going to use some of my grey here. It's gone dry, but I'm going to reactivate it with a bit of water. So with this technique, I'm going to just paint the wing of my seagull. So I'm thinking actually I want it to be quite dark near the top. So I'm going to go back into my palette, add some colour, quite dark near the top and lighter towards the bottom. So actually what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put a line of darker paint at the top of the wing, rinse my brush, dry my brush, put a little bit of water on the paintbrush, and I'm going to just use that water to bring that colour down. So you can see it sort of moved when I touched it there. You're dragging the paint from the top line of colour down into the rest of your shape. If you feel like it's a bit wet, just dry your brush. That will give you more control over that colour. So if you want a sort of marbly effect, put lots of dark colour up at the top and you use that to drag it down into the rest of your painting. If you want to go back and add a bit more of the darker colour at the top, then you can. You think about where you want your shading to be, maybe around this curve. That is your wet on dry technique. The wet on wet technique is slightly different. I'm just going to replenish a bit of my grey in my palette. Okay, so with the wet on wet technique, what you do is you get your paper wet first. So with a clean brush, bit of water, keep tapping it on the side of your water container so it's not dripping wet. And I'm going to trace the outline of the wing. You'll see whether you're getting any water on there, not sopping wet, but enough to see that it is completely wet. And you have to work quite quickly with this technique because it does dry quite quickly. So now the wing is wet. I'm going to wet my brush, dip into my palette, and when I press down on the wet, you'll see that colour starting to spread. So you can do a few dots onto the wing and then use your brush just to work that colour around to where you want it to go. So wet on wet technique's really good for backgrounds. It's really good for places where you want quite subtle colour changes, whereas wet on dry, you can get more of a pattern and some more striking colours. But the wet on wet is if you've got some nice light tones that maybe change. You can still keep going to your palette and adding on more specks of colour if you want to add that texture into your work. But that's essentially it, those few techniques that you're using. So decide which part of your birds for your main piece you are going to use the wet on dry and which you might use wet on wet. Think about how you're going to change your colour gradients or mix your colours using your palette. And the last thing we need to talk about is that you need to rinse your palettes and make sure that you're drying them thoroughly with a paper towel. I have not rinsed this. I'm going to do it after the video so there isn't a messy one, so that they're clean and dry for the next people to use. I'm checking my paints here. They're not too wet on the top, which is a good sign. If they are wet, just leave them open to dry for a bit before you put the lid on. Have fun painting.